Abort, abort. Not a word we use often, but abortion is one we hear all the time. So often, in fact, that it may have started to lose its meaning and shock value. Isn't it strange how that can happen? We use a word so often that eventually it means nothing. If you hear abortion is health care often enough, it almost seems true and real. Outside and before the context that abortion currently means, abort meant to bring to a premature end because of a problem or fault. So with the suffix at the end, the shun means, as some of you may remember from English class in high school, act of or condition of. So an abortion is the act of bringing to a premature end because of a problem or fault. A premature end. Ending something before it should be ended. And that is exactly what it is. Except it's not just ending something. It's murder. Plain and simple. When someone is murdered, it's also ending something before it should be ended. Is that a premature ending? Or is it a tragedy? Welcome back to Canadian Rubies. We're a podcast for Christian women in Canada. If you caught our first episode 2 weeks ago, thanks for joining us and welcome back. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I encourage you to go back and be emboldened to embrace your femininity in 2026. You can find Canadian Rubies on Instagram and hopefully wherever you find your podcasts. We have new episodes coming out every other Wednesday. So today we're talking about abortion, which of course is such a huge topic for us as Christians in this modern world we live in. I know it's a topic I will come back to again and again. In fact, in the process of writing this episode, I already started another abortion episode because there is just so much to say. Sometimes I think we don't need to talk about this with fellow Christian conservatives. We're all on the same page. But time and time again, I see that we are not. So many have bought into the progressive argument that this is a nuanced conversation. It's not so black and white. But wait, it's not nuanced. It is black and white. It's as black and white as life and death, because it is. According to the Angus Reid Institute, in 2022, only 8% of Canadians were completely pro-life. 41% said they were somewhere between the two sides, basically meaning most of them think it should be allowed, but with some limitations or laws. And 52% said they were completely pro-choice. Those numbers were very surprising to me, not necessarily the percentage of completely pro-choice, but the percentage of completely pro-life. In the 2021 census, 53% of Canadians claimed to be Christian. Almost 30% of all Canadians claim to be Catholic, which is one of the most outspoken Christian denominations against abortion. That should be a slam dunk. We should have 53% of Canadians who believe abortion is wrong, always. But instead, we have 52% who believe it is always okay, no matter the reason or gestational age. Pro-choice means no laws or limitations. Now, some studies from 2020 are more generous and show more Canadians who would be interested in some sort of restrictions, which I pray is true, but this study is the most recent one I could find. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of abortion law here in Canada. Today we're mostly looking back through history to say, how did we get here and what matters now? This is a very research-heavy episode, so hopefully I can keep you engaged on the way and it doesn't feel too much like a high school lecture. Although I do have a history of lecturing high schoolers. And they once told me that when I have a lot to say, I slip into a monotone flight attendant's voice. Always happy to hear some useful criticism. So if you have any thoughts to share on today's episode or any of the things I say, feel free to reach out on Instagram or email me at canadian.rubies@gmail.com. And hopefully I am not a flight attendant today. Before we go back to the very beginning and Canada's first criminal code, let's take a quick look at the Canadian government's current stance on abortion. I honestly thought for a long time that the Canadian government was passive on the issue of abortion. They didn't have a law against it, but they didn't have a law for it, and were just apathetic and uninvolved. I've heard Christians say, we don't need a pro-life politician, because that's not their role. We need someone who is conservative on the economy and can run a government, but doesn't get involved in the more social issues. But the government is involved and has a clear bias and opinion. They are promoting abortion. In their own words, abortion is healthcare, and the Government of Canada is committed to upholding your fundamental right to choose. So that sounds pretty bad. But wait, there's more. If you're wondering how pro-abortion the government is, their webpage on abortion includes an orange warning sign next to a small subheading on crisis pregnancy centers. Within this warning, the government claims crisis pregnancy centers are usually run by anti-abortion organizations. They often look like clinics or support centers, but they are designed to encourage people from getting an abortion. The website also includes a number of links to pro-abortion resources, helplines, supports, and education. A couple links do give information on other options like adoption or parenting, but all include pro-abortion information. One of the links is to a page titled Sex and You, which is from the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, which includes this super helpful red text pointing you to the exit button at the top of the page so that your abortion and even the thought of it can be completely private. On the provincial level, according to their own health websites and abortion programs, most provinces and territories do not require a doctor's referral or parental consent. Legally, there is no limit on gestational age in Canada, so technically you can abort for the full 9 months. However, many hospitals and clinics claim to have imposed limitations on gestational age due to the training of the doctors, because not all residents have the opportunity to train in abortion. Because of this caveat, many public figures and everyday Canadians try to convince themselves that late-term abortions wouldn't or don't happen. However, in 2023, right now, went undercover to see what the late-term abortion experience in Canada was actually like, and if they could receive a late-term abortion for no other reason than a personal choice. They could find healthcare workers willing to perform abortions at late stages in all 3 major cities they investigated: Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. In Vancouver, they weren't able to do it much later than 26 weeks, but were willing to send them to the States, where they would be eligible to have the procedure covered by their provincial healthcare coverage. Just to be clear, viability, the age when a baby is able to survive outside the womb, is around 24 weeks. So those pregnancies could technically be prematurely terminated by delivery. So how did we get here? I'm assuming and hoping that much of this information is known to most of you, but I wanted to go through it all very clearly as a refresher to set us up for the current reality and what happens next. Abortion laws in Canada started back in 1869, when Parliament made abortion illegal with the penalty on practitioners of life in prison. When Canada's first criminal code was enacted in 1892, it included 4 laws pertaining to abortion. Section 271 called for an indictable offense and potential imprisonment for life to anyone who causes the death of any child which has not become a human being in such a manner that he would have been guilty of murder if such a child had been born. This section maintained the caveat that an attempt to preserve the life of the mother which resulted in the death of a child before or during birth would not be counted as guilty. Section 272 maintained the same punishment for anyone who caused a miscarriage through the administration of drugs or the unlawful use of any instruments. Section 273 held the mother responsible for attempting to complete her own abortion, with an indictable offense and a punishment up to 7 years imprisonment. Finally, Section 274 promised up to 2 years imprisonment for anyone who supplied the drugs or instruments used. Over the years, the section numbers switched, and some of the wording changed, but the general laws remained the same until 1969. In the early 1960s, second wave feminism began, which was less focused on workplace equality and the right to vote, and more focused on sexuality, family, and reproductive rights. And do you know how many societal issues stem from the work of these feminists? Unsurprisingly, the Canadian government began inquiries into sexism in Canada. In 1967, the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada was established. According to the government website, this commission, which is just a fancy term for a government-appointed body or committee, was mandated to inquire into and report upon the status of women in Canada, and to recommend what steps might be taken by the federal government to ensure equal opportunities for women in all aspects of Canadian society. As we know, it always works out well when the government is determined to stick its fingers into all aspects of society. One of the responsibilities of this committee in 1967 was to make a recommendation for a change in the Criminal Code's laws against abortion. The Commission's official recommendation gave 3 different circumstances in which abortion should be made legal. For any circumstance up to 12 weeks gestation, and after 12 weeks, when the health or life of the mother was at risk, or if the child was suspected to be greatly handicapped, either physically or mentally. This was published in 1970. By the date of publication, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau had already made abortion legal. Trudeau's Criminal Law Amendment Act was passed by Parliament in May 1969. Among other things, this act legalized homosexuality, contraceptives, and abortion. Abortion was legalized only in the cases where the health or life of the mother was at risk. In order to ensure this was being done properly, the Act established therapeutic abortion committees. These committees needed at least 3 medical practitioners, and it was their responsibility to decide if any requested abortion in their hospital were medically necessary. If you want to compare this with the states, during this time, California was the only state that allowed for any kind of abortion, and it was just moving away from a similar committee rule to open season. Any woman could request an abortion for any reason and be protected under the state constitution. Back in Canada, one doctor kept challenging the law by opening abortion clinics and performing abortions without a committee. He did this in multiple provinces, and while he was imprisoned once, most of the courts decided the law couldn't be enforced. Eventually, appeals made it to the Supreme Court. In 1988, the Supreme Court concluded that the current laws regarding abortions could not stand because, as the Chief Justice of the Court, Brian Dixon, stated, forcing a woman by threat of criminal sanction to carry a fetus to term unless she meets certain criteria unrelated to her own priorities and aspirations is a profound interference with a woman's body and thus a violation of security of the person. Basically, the legal jargon of my body, my choice. All restrictions on abortion were removed. The security of person is a reference to Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, which states, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. A few other things of note happened between 1969 and 1988. 1970 brought a pro-abortion protest with an abortion caravan that traveled from Vancouver to Ottawa, where they held demonstrations for 2 days. They carried signs with statements like, abortion is our right, smash capitalism, free abortion on demand. The state has no business in the wombs of the nation, and don't rock the cradle, rock the boat. You can see the feminist background in their attitudes and statements. As the caravan made their way across Ontario, supporters in Ottawa pasted up signs that said, "The women are coming." And ever since those feminist movements, it has been the women who have most loudly and staunchly and grotesquely promoted, demanded, and enlarged the abortion industry. What did we say last time was the first biblical trait of femininity, tracing back to the name of the first woman? Mothering. Nurturing. Trapped by the devil, it is this role that the world tries its hardest to deny. For me, the don't rock the cradle, rock the boat was particularly sickening to see. But I think it's important to share, because it can feel like society is more calloused and grotesque in their comments and rallying cries for abortion today. But since the beginning of this movement in Canada, it has been that way. It was never, and will never truly be about so-called healthcare. It's about self-centeredness and narcissism and the me culture that has grown out of the feminist and hippie movements. In 1974, the Canadian Association for Repeal of the Abortion Law, or CARA, was established. It was a group of abortion rights activists who wanted to support the doctor who was being jailed for performing illegal abortions and continue to push for the laws to be changed. In 1980, they changed their name to the Canadian Abortion Rights Action League. They raised funds for the doctor's legal fees and spread propaganda that abortion was a basic human right. After abortion was legalized, the League continued with the new goal to keep abortion legal and improve access to it in Canada. They shut down in 2004 because they had reportedly achieved their goal in legalizing abortion and providing easy access for Canadians. They were replaced by the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, who felt that a coalition needed to continue in 2005 because, as they said, the anti-choice movement in Canada is still strong and active, with a large base of supporters and organizational resources that far exceed those of the pro-choice movement. That might be the best news you hear in this episode. 35 years later, the pro-abortion groups are still concerned about the power and tenacity of the pro-life movement. We know the power they fear, because we declare it in Psalm 68, verse 3. Awesome is God from his sanctuary, the God of Israel. He is the one who gives power and strength to his people. Blessed be God. May he continue to strengthen our movement and our resolve. In 1975, the government established the Committee on the Operation of the Abortion Law, also known as the Badgley Committee. They were supposed to look at the current law in the criminal code, the one with the therapeutic abortion committee requirements and health of the mother as the only valid reason, and see what that actually looked like in practice and basically how it was going. Shockingly, they found that the health of the mother was a difficult thing to identify and define. Their official report was released in 1977. That brings us back up to 1988. The Supreme Court of Canada had ruled that women have rights to security of person, which could include abortion. We Need a Law is clear on the fact that they did not answer all of the questions nor establish a law. All this court ruling did was create a vacuum that removed one law, hopefully, to make room for another. The federal government then introduced Bill C-43, which would amend the criminal code to make an abortion illegal unless it threatens the mother's physical, mental, or psychological health. There were a lot of protests across the country in response, but the bill still made it through the House of Commons in May of 1990. However, it was defeated in the Senate with a tie vote in the following year. The pro-abortion movements continued to grow from here, while pro-life advocates continued to make attempts to bring reform to the laws and bring the value of life back to Canada. You may remember in 2008, the Unborn Victims of Crime Act, or Bill C-484, was brought to the House. The goal was to amend the criminal code by making injury, death, or attempted death of a child before or during its birth, while committing an offense against the mother, an additional crime. Pro-abortion activists were horrified by this bill because it would do what they had been desperately trying not to do, which is give value and acknowledge life inside the womb. Similar bills were also introduced in 2006, 2010, 2016, and 2023. Bill C-484 is of note because it is the only bill that made it past the second reading. It was then sent to committee, where it died. This is the furthest any type of pro-life bill has made it since 1988. There are a few more important things to note in this history of abortion worship here in Canada. Remember the doctor who opened clinics illegally and continued to offer abortions to force the hands of the court? I haven't named him, intentionally. You know when there's a mass shooting and they don't name the shooter because they don't want to give him fame or encourage copycats? That's what I'm trying to do here. He personally committed thousands of abortions, and his actions opened the door to millions of murders of babies here in Canada. He deserves no recognition, but he got it. On July 1, 2008, he received the Order of Canada, which is one of the most well-known honors given to civilians in Canada. The Governor General's webpage describes this award as recognizing outstanding achievement, dedication to the community, and service to the nation. Let's be real. Most moms I know serve the nation better within their homes, loving their families and teaching their children, than this man who enabled the murder of millions of Canadians. Some of you may remember the outrage that came with the announcement of this appointment. Several groups and individuals, including some politicians, spoke out against this appointment, but sadly, nothing changed. Then in 2017, mifepristone became legal in Canada. This drug, which is actually a brand name for a protocol with two drugs, mifepristone and misoprostol, was approved for use by Health Canada in 2015. It's a drug that causes medical abortions, meaning there is no surgery required. Generally, this drug can only be used up to 9 to 10 weeks gestation. When mifepristone first came out, there were restrictions included, such as a necessary ultrasound to confirm the gestational age of the baby, and in-person appointments before receiving the prescription. By 2019, all restrictions were dropped, and all provinces cover the full cost in their healthcare. Today, anywhere from 40 to 60% of abortions in Canada are medical. The reason it's such a broad range is that clinics that provide abortions are not required to report their activities to the government like hospitals are, so all reporting for clinics is voluntary. The Canadian Institute for Health Information reported 41% of abortions in 2023 were medical. This is the official number based on all the hospital and clinic reportings. So we know there is some missing data here. Earlier abortions are more likely to be completed by a clinic than a hospital, so it is possible that the data is very skewed. In any case, the accessibility to mifepristone has certainly increased the convenience of abortion. In some provinces and territories, you don't even need an in-person appointment. You can be screened and receive a prescription through a virtual or phone appointment. To wrap up the timeline, in 2021, the Sexual and Reproductive Health Fund was established in Canada. The main goal of this fund was to improve access to abortion across Canada, especially for the underserved communities. While there are good things identified in the sexual reproductive health services that are supposedly being promoted, including prenatal and postnatal care and testing for and treating for cancers of reproductive organs, the fund does not exclude pregnancy centers. The fund does exclude pregnancy centers and any initiatives that oppose the freedom of choice. Of the 20 projects that are either completed or currently in action, funded by the SRH Fund, 11 of them explicitly claim part of their goal to be supporting the 2S LGBTQ+ community, or at least a couple of these lettered groups. That tells you a lot about the goals of this fund. And how many millions of dollars is going towards this? In 2021, $45 million was budgeted, and then it was renewed in 2023 for another $36 million, which is supposed to take us to 2027. And I guess we will just see what happens then. Quick math, that's $81 million to mostly progressive projects and programs. So that's a long, seemingly depressing timeline. But it's not all doom and gloom. Multiple times attempts have been made to bring some sort of abortion law into play, and there are still organizations working on this today. We Need a Law is constantly fighting for abortion laws. Currently, they're trying to meet the international standards of other first world countries. These are somewhat simple measures, such as requiring a 48-hour waiting period between the request and the actual procedure, requiring some sort of independent counseling before the procedure, and ideally, a time limit that would prohibit abortion after 13 weeks gestation. I know some people don't like these laws because they allow for abortion, But remember, these are not the end goal. These restrictions are just the beginning. Prohibiting abortion after the first trimester would save thousands of lives. And isn't every life worth saving? I absolutely agree with you that it is not enough, but it is something. It takes many steps to travel a kilometer, and with no laws at all, we are kilometers away from any sort of law that would prevent all abortion. That will take several steps, several laws, several years. But every life is worth fighting for, and every small limitation saves a life and brings us one step closer. I think most of the laws that we need a law suggesting are pretty self-explanatory or logical, but some may have questions about establishing a requirement for counseling. Right now, discovered in their 2023 undercover investigation that a Toronto clinic informed their patients that they did not need counseling and could not be forced to undergo counseling. However, research has shown that this missing aspect is actually extremely important for a number of reasons. According to the Elliott Institute, an institute in the US that was established to study the effects of abortion on women, families, and societies, this is a common problem in the abortion industry. According to a study they referenced from the Medical Science Monitor, 79.2% of women said they were not counseled on alternatives to abortion, with 66.8% claiming they didn't receive any counseling beforehand. And 84% felt they didn't receive adequate counseling beforehand, even though 54.2% of them said they were not sure about the decision to have an abortion when they actually had it. This study also looked at positive and negative outcomes attributed to the abortion by the women who went through it. 13.8% said they felt relief, while 53.9% said they felt badly, and 77.9% experienced guilt. 36.4% of them had thoughts of suicide. 59.5% of them said they felt like a part of them had died. 62.2% were unable to forgive themselves. And 2.3% ended up being hospitalized for psychiatric issues. This study is gut-wrenching. I don't know why it isn't shared more often. The purpose of the study itself was to compare American responses with Russian, and the Russian numbers were far lower in all of the negative responses. The Russian women generally came in more confidently with more counseling beforehand. But really, the comparison doesn't have much interest for me because the facts for the American participants are awful. And Canada's culture is certainly closer to the US than to Russia. This study did take place back in 2004, but I'm not so sure that it would be much different today. Even after a study like this, pro-abortion groups still have the audacity to claim that crisis pregnancy centers spread false information and try to dissuade people from getting abortions, as if the actual healthcare providers are only sharing truth and not pushing people into abortions before they have time to make decisions. These groups are also upset that crisis pregnancy centers diagnose their clients with post-abortion stress disorder, because according to the pro-abortion communities, that doesn't exist, even though the study I just mentioned clearly shows otherwise. Sick and twisted. At least let the women get help after they go through a procedure that intentionally kills their child. According to the Government of Canada website, abortion is one of the most commonly performed medical procedures in the country, and around 1 in 3 women in Canada will have an abortion in their lifetime. Like last time, I'd like to close this out with some prayer suggestions and requests. Hopefully after hearing all this, your heart is heavy with the need to pray. So, for our society and culture, Let us pray that their eyes may be opened to the reality of life in the womb and the value of all life, from the moment of conception to natural death. Let us pray that the wounds of abortion are healed by our great physician, and that women who have experienced this pain may become great advocates for life. For yourself, pray that God would strengthen you to continue fighting for life here in Canada or wherever you are, and that He would provide opportunities for you and others to share that celebration with those around them and with the governing bodies. For Canadian Rubies, please pray that we may remain firm on this and never back away from sharing the truth of the abortion factories and the value of life. The closing prayer for today is from 1 Chronicles 29, verse 11. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all.